First, I want to say thank you so much for having me. I've had a lovely time in your city. Dr. Primack has been the consummate host. It's just been such a wonderful time being in Pittsburgh, enjoying your campus, and I really want to thank you for having me. I want to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. When I was going to college to a very conservative religious school, it was really popular for people to wear those WWJD or What Would Jesus Do bracelets, but it was largely performative because very few of those folks were feeding the thousands or giving everything they had to the poor or Jesus-y things. It did not occur to me until much later that things like driving money changers out of the temple or flipping over tables or like brandishing a homemade whip or any of that kind of thing would have been equally as appropriate. Because unlike the blonde, white, serene-looking Jesus in the paintings on the walls in my church and home, the Jesus of the Bible was not above getting pretty angry. Now, different idea. When Aristotle described the proofs of an argument, he said the artistic proofs, or the proofs that we bring to the argument ourselves, come in the form of appeals to logos, pathos, and ethos. Some of you may know these words pretty well by now. We generally think of the translation of that as being appeals to logic, emotion, and character. And I think that's a really fascinating place to start when we think about how to create a balanced argument, because that's actually very different than the message we learn in school, or even from the people who demand civil discourse from the public. There's this narrative that all public rhetoric should be rational and logical, or even sterile to be legitimate. But that's not where we began. That's not what an argument was ever meant to be. Aristotle couched a good argument not just in logic, but in the whole person. An argument that is effective appeals to us at all levels, to our reason, to our passions, and to our character. And in truth, we know that. A purely logical argument with no emotion or no appeals to character is, quite frankly, off-putting. If you don't have any emotion or character, you are at best AI, at worst a sociopath. And the same can be said for the opposite. If you have only emotion and character and lack all reason, you're a demagogue. Okay, so why did I start with Jesus with all of this? Because Jesus got angry. Jesus spoke truth to those in power. And there are those who would have you believe he was always this milquetoast, vanilla, subservient guy. But people who say that are lying to you in the service of empire. Now, you don't have to believe in any kind of divinity or miracle to buy into any of this. That's fine. I'm not here to teach you a religious lesson. But the thing is, the story that comes from that is a story of political radicalism. We forget that that story of a guy called Jesus was a story of a man who was executed by the state. You do not get executed by the state unless you are causing such upheaval that the state says, this is a problem. The state came after a man who said, I am going to disrupt. Now, there are a lot of angry people out here right now, on many different sides of many different issues. And I am here to tell you that it is okay to be angry. It is okay to be passionate. It's okay to feel strongly. You are not uncivil because you are upset. The fight for justice does not happen in cold, unfeeling lectures from behind state podium like this one. It happens in ground-level demonstrations, or it happens in activated organizations. It happens when people come together. It happens when people are passionate. And there are certain things you should be mad about. Racism should make you furious. Transphobia should make you livid. Rape culture should enrage you. Not because they are political, but because you are a decent person who cares about your fellow humans. And nobody has the right to disenfranchise you because you take things seriously. Now, my colleagues here are going to tell you rightly that our goal in a democracy should be open, honest debate in which we come to conclusions, if not consensus, in an effort to solve our complicated problems. And I want to assure you that I am not here to contradict that. But what I am here to tell you is that a call for honest debate does not require you to dissociate from what you believe at your core. All too often, calls for civil discourse are used to silence dissent. And we are here to talk about protest. We are here to talk about people who are so upset, so angry at their situation, that they are willing to do what Martin Luther King Jr. said, that they should, and create a community crisis so unavoidable, so tension-inducing, that the establishment would have to respond. And I argue that there is nothing uncivil about that. There is nothing uncivil about demanding your rights. There is nothing uncivil about insisting on your humanity. There is nothing uncivil about insisting on equity and equality. People think of the root of civil discourse as being civility, but I will ask you to think of it as civilization. Civil discourse is not how we play nice. It is how we build our society. It is how we create ourselves as a people. Democratic debate is not about how polite we can be to each other. It is about the hard work of building who we are. And I don't know if you've ever been to a building site, but it is tough work. There's blood and sweat and a lot of swearing. In my mind, this should be the guiding metaphor for civil discourse. Not some set of rules for polite society, but the rough and callous-causing work of building a democracy. So, as we think this evening about what it means to debate, what it means to protest, to demand equality or respect, or to manage the difficult task of balancing the needs of the many groups vying for our attention, I encourage you to think beyond the confines of polite discussion. I encourage you to think not just about whether you are going to please other people with their message, but how are you going to contribute to the construction of the civilization you want to be a part of. Because I know that is what civil discourse is. And I know that is what you are here for. You've spent weeks now thinking about what it means to have a debate, and listening to quote-unquote experts tell you about protest, or fear, or constitutional interpretation, all these things you've been listening to us talk about. But all of that is secondary to what you believe your own part is in building democracy. I know you want to be involved because you are here. Our question then is not, should I, but how. How do I engage? How do I create equity? What can be done to advance the cause of liberty? I don't know how you will do it, personally, but I know it will take your whole person. Do not let anyone convince you that you have to tone down your voice to take part in democracy. Your voice is your power. Brandish it with all you've got. Thank you. Over to Kevin Johnson, who will tell you what you really need to know.
I'm always tempted in following Dr. Thorpe to say what she said and just sit down. But instead, I think, have some complementary things that we had talked about before as we were solving the world's problems that I would like to share with you today. I'd like to thank Dr. Primack and the Finegold Debate Forum for having me as a guest today. The hospitality has been wonderful. I love coming here. This is my second visit, and you have a really special place here to do your learning, and I hope that you really acknowledge that and take advantage of it while you're here. I want to begin with the idea that I never really thought that public debate would be a revolutionary idea. Not when I got into it 30 years ago when I started speaking in my high school debate team. I never thought that it was all that controversial. And yet when I look at the way that debate is practiced today, I find that it is revolutionary. It seems like people are talking past each other more and more than they're conversing in this idea of democracy. And democracy and public debate go hand in hand, because public debate is premised on the democratic assumption of sharing power, and the idea of sharing power is either on the brink of collapse today or perhaps already collapsed. It's in these spaces where we're able to share the power with each other, that your vote counts just as much as my vote, regardless of the expertise that I have. We have to figure out a way to collectively imagine our futures together. And the way that that happens is through that deliberative process of debate, in my opinion. It's about taking the beliefs that Dr. Thorpe talks about and figuring out what your beliefs are. What are my beliefs? What are the things that are true to us? And how are we going to envision a life together in this democratic space? That's the challenge that we face in the context of public debate. And there's three areas that I think that I would like to talk about that influence the way that we think about public debate today. The first of which is the idea of the dromocracy. Paul Virilio calls a dromocracy as a politics that's ruled by speed, rather than the idea of the politics that is ruled by the ideas that we have. That means that we have very little time to debate about an issue before that issue is yesterday's news. The politics of the dromocracy says that it's your way, right away, at Burger King now, right? It's your way or no way, right? We don't have time to truly deliberate with much depth before we're on to the next issue. And then we're on to the next issue. And then we're on to the next issue. And that debate never really gets to the level of depth where we can come up with some ground that we're willing to share in order to move the events further. I mean, for goodness sakes, it was just in January, 2 months ago-ish, that we had the attack in New Orleans, right? We never even debated that. It was out of the news within a week. We don't even know what that means. How are we going to prevent a truck from riding down a populated area? We haven't discussed that. What kinds of things do we want to put in place in order to prevent that? That's no longer a question. We moved on to the presidential transition. We moved into executive order after executive order after executive order. Before we can debate about the legitimacy of one executive order, another executive order is passed, right? And so we spend this whole time trying to figure out kind of both what's going on, but also not being able to have those spaces of deliberation that require the kind of depth that we need. Paul Virilio's observation is that as things speed up and we don't have the ability to talk about and to deliberate these spaces anymore, we shift to a dromocracy where it's a politics ruled by speed. And when we're ruled by a politics of speed, rather than a lengthy public debate or a series of debates, much like the ones that we're invoking on the path of tonight, what we end up getting is a politics that's ruled by rage, where we end up shouting at each other and yelling at each other and not having any real meaningful dialogue or deliberation. So in that sense, I return to that kind of high school experience where deliberation has become a revolutionary activity, to share a space with people that we disagree with, to be able to attempt to try to find some expectation of mutuality in that space, rather than getting our way right away at wherever now. The second thing that I think is impacting our public debate is the movement away from a public sphere to an increasing technical sphere. We have this notion of the public sphere where we would debate about a lot of issues. However, as we have proliferated the notion of expertise, we become less equipped to handle it. It's much easier to just leave it in the hands of the experts. If you have a question about how we want our healthcare system to run, leave it to the doctors. If you want to debate about how we should be reconfiguring our highway system, leave it to the civil engineers. If we want to debate about how education ought to run, leave it to the experts in education, right? Things that we don't necessarily debate about in that public sphere way anymore, because the notion of expertise has grown that we are not now qualified to talk about these issues. I'm more qualified to talk about freedom of expression and how you ought to assemble yourselves in public spaces than you are. I don't believe that. I believe that in a public sphere, in a public dialogue, we all have voices and opinions about how we should share that public space, how we should work through issues of maybe incitements to violence and what we think is an incitement to violence, and whether or not we want to allow guns to be present at a protest, and these kinds of difficult questions that we face in our current day. But the shrinking of the public sphere has led to a rise in the technical sphere where it's just better to leave to the experts. It's not up to us to decide. It's much easier to just trust those people that are in those decision-making calculus. Even if that's true, maybe we can think about ways to revise that technical sphere, right? Maybe in the place of having presidential candidates debate, we have them kind of pre-select who their cabinet members would be. So we have the competing Department of Transportation, the Secretaries of Transportation, debate an entire evening or series of debates like this one on how we want our transportation policy to run. Maybe we have a series of debate about the prospective leaders in the Department of Education to see how they would think about the issue of education in our public life. Instead, what we get, similar to the politics of the democracy, is that we get a shotgun approach, where a presidential candidate debates against another presidential candidate, and it's like a game of whack-a-mole with moving targets from one subject to another subject, never getting into that kind of depth that we need in order to make these kinds of informed decisions. So that influences the way that we think about the public and the private. The third thing is that we need to figure out a way to kind of share information. We've moved away from the marketplace of ideas, and we're now in the realm of the marketplaces of ideas. We shop for our information in different places. We're no longer occupying the same public squares. The algorithms program our social media profiles. We tune into Fox News or MSNBC or CNN or NPR or any other place that we want to find our news. So we're literally shopping in different marketplaces, right? It's not a shared marketplace of ideas anymore. This idea of the algorithmic marketplaces is shaping the way that we share our information, that we think about what is credible information has shifted. We are no longer having common ground in the way that we get our information, and so therefore, how can we have common ground in the way that we share power, right? The information has to be in a more unique set of marketplaces of ideas. So today, what that means is that it means slowing down. This public debate is a way of slowing down. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about an issue about disruptive process. We're talking about debates in the technical sphere, maybe having a politics where we think about the technical sphere differently. That if we want to figure out what our health policy should be, we should have debates from health professionals instead of public officials that may not be experienced in the way that health systems are working. It also means that there's a political act in desegregating our marketplaces of ideas and having an integrated approach to the way that we have that go down. In sum, assessing the damage to this current state of public debate requires an accurate assessment of the nature of power, the way tensions between people and the state are resolved in terms of sharing that power, and as the debates will likely explore this evening, assuming there's decent clash, it's always a nice assumption, that as this debate this evening will explore the nature of institutional adaptation to forces of disruptive protest. The way that institutions react to that disruptive protest will then be the gauge of whether or not we are able to slow down, create deliberative spaces, create a marketplace of ideas rather than marketplaces of ideas, and whether or not we are able to move the context of public debate from the technical sphere back to a more mediated public sphere. Thank you.